In 2006, 35-year-old Ricky Megee would find himself lost in the northeast fringe of the Australian Tanami Desert for 71 days. Later, he would be described by those who found him as a walking skeleton. What is just as interesting as his story of survival is the mystery of how he actually found himself in this situation. First, the car he was travelling in would never be confirmed to have been found by police, whilst Ricky himself believes it was. Ricky's description of the events leading up to his ordeal has changed significantly over time. First, he would tell rescuers that his car had broken down, but later tell the Washington Post a much more harrowing tale. For the sake of this video, I will be telling his story as he does in his book, but no one other than Ricky will know the absolute truth. In January 2006, Ricky was on his way to see a friend in Halls Creek, Western Australia, intending to stop for a short time before starting a job in the town of Port Hedland. Deciding to take a shortcut, Ricky would find himself driving along the Bunteen Highway, a dirt track that links Western Australia with the Northern Territory. After hours of driving, Ricky reaches the Kalkaringi petrol station, fills up and grabs his first can of Coke and rum from the cooler in the backseat of his Mitsubishi Challenger. Continuing on the Bunteen Highway, and now on his third can, Ricky spots three men leaning against their car in the sweltering heat on the side of the dirt highway. Wanting to help the men, like he had done many times before, but cautious all the same, Ricky locks all his doors and reminds himself of the machete he keeps under his driver's seat. Leaving just his passenger side window down, he pulls off the road a short distance away, and one of the men approaches. The man, who looked to be in his late 20s, explains they had run out of petrol and asked for a lift to Halls Creek. Ricky tells him he can give him a lift, and watches in his rearview mirror as the man runs back to the two waiting by the car. He sees the oldest of the three give the hitchhiker instructions before he returns to the car and gets in the passenger side. As the two take off, the beginning of the car ride is quiet. The man, being from a remote Aboriginal community, only speaks a limited amount of English. Soon, Ricky gestures to the man to grab himself a can of rum and coke, and the conversation turns to polite small talk despite the language barrier. 20 minutes into the drive, Ricky's drunk his way through the can sitting in his lap, so his new passenger reaches into the esky in the back seat, grabs another, and opens it for him. Taking no notice, Ricky continues drinking, but after 10 minutes starts to feel disorientated, his vision warped. Struggling to keep his eyes open, his passenger opens another can and shows no concern as the car swerves across the road. When Ricky's eyes open, he's now in the passenger seat, head buried in his chest and parked on the side of the highway. He can hear the voices of a man and a woman talking outside of the car, but still dazed, he can't figure out what they're saying. Getting his bearings, he looks out the window and sees the all too familiar red dirt with trees and green grass sporadically placed around him, but day is now turning to night. As he gets out of the car, the voices, which were coming from behind some bushes, become quieter. Still disorientated, Ricky gets into the driver's seat, finds the keys still in the ignition, and gets ready to drive off. Just before he hits the accelerator, a figure bursts from the shadows and jumps onto the footstools on the back of the car. Surprised, Ricky looks back to see a man whose face is obscured by a bandana clinging to the back of his car. Ricky gets out, still dazed and now angry, to yell at this man. The two size each other up and circle one another before Ricky decides to just get back in and drive away. As quickly as Ricky's foot is on the accelerator, the man is back on his position on the footstools. Rather than get out again, Ricky decides to speed up, and the man takes hold of the roof racks on top of the car to steady himself. Even as he speeds up to 100 kilometers an hour and then slams the brakes in an attempt to fling this guy off his car, the man, seemingly unfazed, just doesn't let go. For a short distance, Ricky continues on down the road, before stopping and getting out of the car again. When Ricky gets out and screams at this man asking what it is he wants, the man says nothing and just runs away from Ricky as he chases him. Once he's back inside the car, the man once again attaches himself to the back on the footstools before Ricky takes off. When Ricky reaches 100 kilometers on this bumpy dirt highway, he begins to notice the man swinging what looks like a torch on a piece of rope above his head. At first, Ricky's confused, but then a chilling thought occurs to him. With no other lights for possibly hundreds of kilometers, the man could be using this torch as a beacon for his friends who are further down the road. But if that was his intention, the man wasn't waiting for his friends to get there. Moments later, Ricky would hear the glass shatter behind him and look back to see the man now crawling through the broken glass windscreen and into his back seat. Seconds later, the man's fist connects with Ricky's head and the two begin to wrestle between punches while the car, still going traveling 100 kilometers an hour, bounces down the dirt road. Aware that if he were to swerve off the road and into a tree, both would die, Ricky spots a clearing off to the side of the road and attempts to turn into it. The car, however, catapults through a section of small trees and branches shatter the windscreen, blocking his vision. As the two men continue to fight, Ricky has to sporadically free his head to look out the window and see where they're going. Eventually, the car would hit a patch of dirt and sand, and though the wheels continued moving, the car was now stuck. In this unreal situation, Ricky stepped out of the driver's side door, and the man jumped out of the rear side. No longer fighting, they both just looked at each other for a moment, and then the guy just ran and disappeared into the darkness. Though the hard effects of the suspected drugs he had been given were wearing off, Ricky still felt tired from the come down and was now exhausted with no idea of where he was. Collecting himself, he would decide to look for one of the two torches he had packed, but couldn't find either of them. Still under the effects of whatever he had been given and exhausted from what had just happened, Ricky would collapse into the grass beneath him. Laying in the dark and now freezing desert, Ricky began drifting in and out of consciousness. In the moments he was conscious, in a groggy and exhausted state, he became aware of a group of people moving around him. Soon he would realize these figures in the darkness were searching through his car, and he recognized two of them. One of them was the man he'd given a lift, and the other was the one who'd given the instructions. In a daze, he would call out to them asking what they wanted. Was it money? Was it what was in his car? The car itself? It didn't matter, they could have it all. He just wanted to know what they needed from him. Though they didn't bother to answer his questions, it became apparent to Ricky they hadn't planned on him waking up, and now that he was, what they'd planned to do to him was harder on their conscience. During this time, Ricky would continue to drift between being asleep and aware of what was going on, and at one point a smaller man would approach and point a hunting rifle at him before telling him that he knew what they wanted from him. Ricky would reply telling the man he didn't know, and that if they were going to kill him, they needed to get it over with. After this exchange, the man would just lower his gun and walk away. Ricky was then woken a second time by a young girl who, to his disbelief, asked if he had a cigarette. With really no other option, he pulled one from the packet in his pocket and handed it to her. In return, Ricky asked if she had water, which would get the attention of one of the younger males in the group, who snuck Ricky water from his bottle and asked him to keep it a secret from the others. As the sun rose, Ricky would wake up to find himself no longer near his car, but would spot two vehicles a short distance away. Strangely, when he approached the vehicles, he found it was the same group who had robbed him, and they were now preparing breakfast. Ricky would ask if they hadn't planned to kill him. If they got what they wanted, could they at least point in the right direction to the nearest town so he could start walking? No one would acknowledge him, and it wasn't until he threatened one of the group's members for water that he would be given some. Once again, under the condition he didn't tell the others. The last thing Ricky would remember was drinking the water before everything went dark. When he came to, he was buried in a shallow grave and now missing his shoes, cigarettes, and lighter. After getting himself out of this grave, he checked his pockets and found all he had left was his car keys and some small change. Unaware of how many days had passed, and slowly coming to terms with his newfound situation, Ricky climbed a tree attempting to scan the landscape. To his horror, he was now somewhere completely different to where he'd started a few days before. Hungry, thirsty, and still drowsy from the effects of the drugs he'd been given, Ricky decided to head west in hopes he would hit the highway in a few days. With no other options, Ricky trekked through the 40-degree desert, but found nothing except bare earth. As thirst overcame him, he soon realized he would need to drink his own urine to stay alive. To do this, he would remove his underwear and urinate into them before squeezing the liquid into his mouth. But what was even worse than the urine was the walking without shoes. The scorching and rocky terrain tore his bleeding feet apart with every step. On the first night, Ricky constructed a shelter out of the trees and branches he could find, and tried to comfort himself with the thought that at least someone would be looking for him. While sleeping, he would be lucky enough to encounter a small storm that offered whatever water he could cup in his hands or drink from the leaves of his shelter. For the next 2 days, the trek would continue as usual, but on the third, Ricky would begin to feel the effects of dehydration at full force. While walking, he would occasionally collapse, even passing out for a few hours. Things were looking very grim by the 4th day, but this was the day his luck would change. As Ricky stumbled through the brush, he would come across a river, and his worry of dying from dehydration calmed. There were two other things Ricky was certain the river offered besides its water, one being civilization, which he would eventually have to stumble upon this close to water, and the second, a smoother trail for his torn feet. Hoping to alleviate the pain in his feet from crossing rocks and dirt in 40-degree weather, Ricky decided to continue his trek in the river, but this would have problems of its own. At first, it was just a matter of avoiding trees and branches underwater, but soon a wrong step would see his already cut feet land down on barbed wire from a cattle fence that had found itself in the stream. Not only that, but the path of the river was full of submerged trees blocking the path, and it was inconsistent, at times being full enough to swim in, and at other points having to walk in ankle-deep water and suddenly falling into deep holes. However, this was still a better alternative for his battered feet than the searing hot and jagged rocks he had crossed to get there, and despite the dangers, Ricky would continue following the river. Eventually, he would come across a decrepit windmill. Seeing the windmill offered Ricky hope, because at some point he believed someone may come to it. But not only that, it was a strong shelter close to a clean and reliable source of water. But just like the river, it did not come without its downsides. During the daytime it seemed fine, but at night he would hear the audible buzz of hundreds of mosquitoes as they swarmed around him. Climbing to a higher level of the windmill, Ricky hoped he could keep away from them, but he was soon covered by the insects as they fed on him. Tired, drained, and without anything to stop them, Ricky would try to jump in the river, hoping for some relief, but that still left his face exposed, something the mosquitoes were more than happy to indulge in. The next day, Ricky would find old windmill blades thrown around the area, and with some mud, he would attempt to create a shelter further away from the windmill and riverbed in the hope he could escape the swarms of mosquitoes. While it did help lessen the amount of them, there was nothing he could do to stop all of them from getting in. Though he was grateful for the water that the river provided and was paying the price for it with the mosquitoes who fed on him, hunger would be the next thing to consume his thoughts. At first he would eat grass and mud, but over the next few days the hunger became too much to bear. It was time he made a decision. Though the river provided safety from dehydration, if he were to stay and not be rescued, it was likely he would starve to death. Ultimately, Ricky would decide to leave the windmill shelter and continue down the river in the hopes he would find a farm or homestead and eventual rescue. After days of following the river, he would find two big red gates, fencing, a road, and a sign. The sign would read, Hatesbury Beef County. Though it didn't help Ricky understand where he was, it was another sign of civilization. This thought of civilization was comforting, but the sheer size of some of the cattle stations in the area could mean regardless of the sign, he was still as good as lost to the world. Remaining optimistic, Ricky passed through the red gates and continued walking. As the day wore on, Ricky kept hydrated by drinking the water he found in small dugouts, which were almost always mixed with cow feces. Despite the hours he put in, and every slope he climbed with his bleeding feet, the road continued to reveal nothing but more empty farmland. When the sun began to set, he attempted to roll in cow feces and grass to stay warm and cover his skin, hoping to protect himself from the mosquitoes he'd been fighting for days, which he would quickly find didn't work. The next morning, Ricky started early and continued walking for hours in the heat until finally the road changed, but its change only offered more problems. He was now at an intersection, the road branching, pointing in two different directions. The sign to the right reading Wallamunga Yards and the sign to the left Boree. Thinking that yards would mean a mustering point and a possible cattle station with people, Ricky turned right. Spending more hours in the blistering heat walking, Ricky would eventually come to the end of the road only to find nothing but an empty cattle yard. Deflated, Ricky turned around and walked back the way he had come, arriving back at the intersection by the late afternoon. Here, he would decide to spell out SOS with rocks, in the hope that if a plane was delivering mail to the property, they may see it. After he had finished, he decided before heading to Boree, he would try to find something to eat to curb his hunger. This would turn out to be a crucial mistake. Hoping to find a grub, he would stick his hand into a hollow log and grab onto something with excitement. Only quickly he would feel a sudden pain as the thing inside the log bit him. Pulling it out, he realized what he had grabbed was not a grub but a centipede, and its poison was already causing his finger to swell. As the sun set, the pain and swelling increased, and Ricky found himself at a point of pure misery at his situation, stuck in the middle of nowhere, in the heat, his feet cut and bleeding, causing pain with every step. Despite this, Ricky would continue walking the trail by night, and he would spot something that would lift his spirits. The flashing of lights, what looked like car lights, rising over high ground and dropping down again. Without a second thought, he abandoned his trail and charged off into the empty paddocks and continued running, fueled by the thought of rescue. Twice he would charge into fences he didn't see in the darkness, slamming to the ground, but he got up and kept running, now screaming for help. Tripping over rocks and logs, he would just continue, hoping to find this car. But soon, he would find himself lost, and the lights he had seen flash were now gone. Collapsing by a tree, he would lay there, miserable and in pain, and now with the realization he had run off track and had no idea where he was. Soon Ricky would fall asleep by this tree until he was woken by rain, and he would see what the mystery lights had been. He had spent the night chasing lightning on the horizon. It had all been a waste. Because of this mistake, Ricky would spend the next few days following a fence line, hoping to find his way back to the Boree intersection. After 4 days of walking through the paddock without a cow in sight and drinking water from whatever small holes contained it, he would finally find himself on a track that he believed was the Boree intersection. Though he hadn't seen any cows, he knew if they were around, there had to be some sort of water source, and Ricky would continue walking, hoping that he would find it. After days of walking with only a small lizard and some vegetation for food, Ricky would find what he was looking for, something more valuable than gold. He would find a dam. After drinking all he could, Ricky dug deep into the side of the dam, creating a 3-foot deep hole he could sleep in. His hope was that he would at least escape the mosquitoes which had been hounding him since he first got lost in the desert. Unfortunately, on the first night, he wouldn't escape them from swarming in his mudhole shelter, but this helped in an odd way. His focus shifted from desperate for rescue to building something he could survive in long term. Finding metal star pickets around the dam, he now had a way of digging his hole that wasn't sticks in his hands. With it, over the next few days, and with a reliable source of water and vegetation, he managed to make his hole even bigger and lay it out with grass. The only thing he had to worry about now was the storms, which when bad enough caused the mud of the roof to fall and instilled the fear of being buried alive within him. With this shelter sorted, Ricky's eyes fell on what he could eat around him. This would include crickets, grasshoppers, and even mud crabs burrowed in the dam. One of the more surprising things he ate was leeches, something he found incredibly easy to catch. Ricky would swim out into the dam and just wait for the leeches to latch to him. Once latched, he'd peel them off and eat them. On a few occasions, they would bite his tongue as he was chewing on them, but that only taught him to chew faster. Nothing was out of bounds. He ate ants, a wasp, and even mosquitoes, but soon stopped after fearing he might contract Ross River fever. 5 days into his stay, Ricky would hear a motorcycle and attempt to chase the sound, but never find it. There was also the periodic sound of planes flying in the distance, but Ricky could never locate them. Soon dam levels would begin to dwindle with the lack of rain, and Ricky had virtually eaten anything of substance around him, and once again the decision had to be made to move on and leave behind the shelter he'd spent so long making. For days he would agonize over it, but finally the sounds of planes overhead but unseen got to him, and he decided it was time to keep moving. Packing his pockets with what vegetation he could, Ricky continued forward. A few more days of walking would pass, and the heat of the desert would once again sap Ricky of all he had. Thoughts of turning back to his old shelter were nagging at him when he came out of the tree line and found another dam. Scouring the area, he would find a cow trough which he used as a cover to a shelter, similar to his previous one. The difference between this dam and his other was the supply of meat he found in frogs that he would catch and dry out on wire. During the coming days, Ricky would hear a plane, as he had occasionally, but this time he would actually see it. Jumping atop the trough he used as the roof of his shelter, he waved a branch and screamed at the plane. It was so low he could actually see the pilot, who for a moment he thought had seen him, but the plane flew right over him. Despite this setback, Ricky was sure this dam would be where he would be eventually rescued, and though it had a small number of leeches and no crabs, which were his two favorite foods, it did have an impressive amount of vegetation to feed on. Over the next few months, Ricky would live here, surviving on all the dam had to offer, sure that someone would eventually come to check on the dam. Over time, the leeches disappeared, and the frog life dwindled. Each day, he was able to catch at least 5 to 6 large frogs with ease, but now, with greater effort, he was only getting 2 or 3 smaller ones. Ricky figured he'd eaten all the reproducing adults and needed to give the frogs time to breed, and focused on eating only the vegetation around him. With the dwindling meat sources, his weight dropped rapidly. Even when he had the frogs, he was still dropping weight. Soon his fingers were too thin to cup water without it seeping through, and even his eyelids would not shut properly. Ricky realized he was starving to death, and soon made a small cross above his shelter to hopefully alert someone to the existence of his body should it happen. With the feeling of impending starvation looming over him, an old dingo missing one eye started coming by the dam, and Ricky would talk to it for comfort, though he was sure it was waiting for an easy meal once he died. As the pure sense of starvation set in, Ricky began to get more desperate, even attempting to eat cockroaches he found, but that was the one thing he couldn't stomach. Soon the dingo was coming more and more often, and Ricky began to entertain the idea of eating it, but quickly decided against it. As quickly as he dismissed the thought, the dingo suddenly disappeared, and Ricky wondered if it had grown tired of waiting for him to die. The next day, he would find out why the one-eyed dingo had disappeared when he opened his shelter in the morning, only to find 4 other dingoes waiting for him. They would circle him, but decide against taking him down, and suddenly, Ricky found himself with a real threat on his hands. After his encounter with the dingoes, he would spend the next few days in his shelter using the nearby rocks to board up the entrance, and eventually, they would disappear. But not long after the dingoes, Ricky would encounter another dire situation. One morning when he awoke, there was a great pain on the left side of his face, rendering him unable to open his mouth. At first he would theorize it was a spider bite, and after finding out what the real problem was, he probably wished it was just a spider bite. Shoving his fingers into his mouth to investigate, he felt around and discovered large pus-filled blisters around his gums. One of his teeth had an abscess, something that would not go away on its own, and if ignored, would eventually kill him. Grabbing the wire he had previously used to dry the frogs he had been eating, Ricky used it to cut the gums and try break the blister. As much as he tried, he couldn't pop it with the wire, despite how much he cut into the gums surrounding it. After the wire failed, he decided to sharpen the car key he still had and tried to stab the blister open. This would eventually work, and his mouth would fill with pus and blood, and brought the smell of decay with it. Over the next few days, he would realize that just popping the blisters was not enough. It took some mental preparation, 30 minutes of trying and 4 chipped teeth, but Ricky successfully managed to jam his sharpened key under his tooth and pull upwards. With an audible rip, the tooth finally came out, but he was now faced with another problem. The pain was so intense he could barely eat anything, causing him to seriously consider the fact he was going to starve. 5 days after he'd ripped out his own tooth, he would be laying in his shelter when he heard the sound of an engine. At first, in his weakened state, he dismissed it, but quickly it got louder and closer. Crawling out of his shelter, he couldn't believe it. There was a car approaching. Unable to talk beyond a whisper, Ricky jumped up and down waving his hands, and 2 farmhands pulled over and approached him. As the 2 men approached, Ricky scrambled back into his shelter to grab a few items he had become attached to during his isolation, the key and tooth being 2 of them. The farmhands, who had only come to the dam as an afterthought while in the area, would introduce themselves as Taz and Bruce. By their description, Ricky was a walking skeleton, and this skeleton, who spoke in a whisper, would tell him he was left for dead in the desert on the 24th of January. Taz would tell Ricky it was now the 4th of April. Ricky had spent 71 days lost in the Australian outback and gone from over 100 kilos to 40 kilos in that time. What's important to mention about this story is there are 2 sides to it, and a few skeptics of Ricky's tale. In his past, Ricky had been a debt collector, been to jail for assault in Perth, and charged with drug offences. This led to skepticism on how the events took place, or if they even happened to begin with. Northern Territory Police would state they dismissed suggestions that there was any question of criminal activity on Ricky's part, but they also didn't find any evidence of criminality in reference to Ricky's claims he was attacked, and stated they never found his car. Ricky would counter this claim, saying it was still in the same place he'd left it, as it was stuck in the sand, and 2 locals had actually found it, but police were not interested in locating the vehicle. There were also those who were skeptical of how long he claimed to be out in the desert because they didn't believe he could survive so long in such a harsh landscape. While it's easy to see he underwent dramatic weight loss in a short period, the skeptics voiced doubt over elements to his story and believed he was changing the narrative in an attempt to sell it to national television. When consulted, his doctor would not show support for either argument, simply stating it was very difficult to deny or validate his story because he responded so well to the treatments provided at the hospital. An Australian television presenter and survival expert would counter those who didn't believe Ricky's story, stating it was possible for someone to survive in the bush for up to 3 years. And other survival experts would come to his aid, commending Ricky for his survival as he consistently fulfilled basic requirements such as food, water and shelter. While we may never know the full truth of the story, the pictures alone paint a very real image of a man and his survival. Thank you for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. It's very long. I tried to cut into the points where he was just walking because how much can you talk about just walking? But let me know if you do believe Ricky's story. I am kind of on the rocks about the beginning of it, but the survival aspects seem pretty true to me, though I'm no survival expert. Until next time, guys, thank you.